And welcome to BBC Ask This, where we take your questions and put them to an expert. Here in the studio today, we're talking about what happens now in the Brexit process after last night's indicative votes in the Commons failed to reach a majority consensus on pretty much anything. I'm joined now by Maddy Thimont Jack from the think tank, the Institute for Government. You've been sending in your questions by text, email and Twitter. So Maddy, I'm going to just crack on because the first one from Jerry K says, could the Prime Minister say, I'm in charge and sign off on her deal and ignore her party and Parliament?
Well, at this stage, no, she can't. So the reason that we're going through this whole process at the moment is because of legislation MPs passed last year, the EU Withdrawal Act, the government's flagship Brexit bill, which says that the government cannot ratify a withdrawal agreement until the Parliament, the House of Commons in particular, have approved both the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, and that they've passed the withdrawal agreement bill needed to implement domestic legislation. So that's why we're having these votes in Parliament at the moment, or at least this is why we're having these meaningful votes. And the only way to get around that at this stage would be to introduce the next piece of legislation, the withdrawal agreement bill, and sort of override that provision that was set out last summer to actually say we don't need to have a meaningful vote, for example, to be able to ratify. But if you're going to do that, you need to have MPs approve that. So it's sort of really, MPs have quite an important role at this stage, and the Prime Minister can't get around that.
It's her deal or nothing, for her.
For her at the moment, yes, yeah. Exactly.
So, another question, this is from Heather Ansell. Apart from the backstop, what are the other issues in the Prime Minister's proposed agreement that make it so unappealing to MPs?
So there are,
tend to talk about the backstop.
Exactly. So there are a couple of other issues that some MPs have problems with. So the first is the role that the European Court of Justice is going to play in interpreting how the UK applies EU rules during transition, for example. And also it's going to play quite an important role in enforcing the rights of EU citizens living in the UK after Brexit. Some MPs are also unhappy about the amount of money that we've agreed to pay the EU. Now, this is to pay both for our sort of continuing sort of involvement in EU programmes during transition, but also to pay for some of the obligations that we sort of signed up to as members. But some MPs say it's far too much money.
Question from Simon McCoy here. In terms of the backstop, if we accept it and it comes in, the argument is it opens us up to, well, bribery from various EU countries later on in the next part of negotiations, because the French could easily say, well, we're not going to let you leave the backstop unless you let us fish in your waters. The Spanish could say, well, we're not going to talk about Gibraltar unless we won't let you have the backstop released unless you talk about Gibraltar, things like that. It's the next phase that people are already looking at.
Yeah, I think so. There's sort of two sides to this. The first is the concern that what we've agreed to in the backstop and what is probably quite likely is will become the basis of our future relationship with the EU, because that is the way that we can avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland, and that we're going to have to continue to try and do that in our sort of next phase of our future relationship. But there's also, at the moment, the withdrawal agreement, you actually just need to have a sort of qualified majority in the council to approve it, whereas trade deals, they have to be approved by every single member state, including some sort of regional parliaments. Exactly, and so there's a concern that that's when member states' interests will really come into play. OK.
This question from Jordan. If the Theresa May deal, I guess, was to accept a soft Brexit and remain in the single market and customs union, what benefits would this actually have rather than just remaining? Would the benefits of Brexit be destroyed?
Well, obviously it depends what you're looking for from Brexit, what the benefits are. But I think the key thing about what some of the MPs are proposing in terms of membership of the single market and the customs union is that that really talks to the economic relationship that the UK has with the EU. So you won't be, for example, part of some of the security cooperation, although we do want to maintain security.
This was the first referendum. Back in the 70s,
exactly.
It was a purely economic decision.
Exactly, whereas now there are sort of wider elements of cooperation that we are now sort of part of as members of the EU, so on foreign and defence policy, security policy, and you know, some people would say that actually it's really important to maintain that cooperation, but that is sort of what you wouldn't be necessarily part of. But I think, you know, there are some questions around what exactly you can do in terms of being able to negotiate new trade deals, and that's obviously some people's concern, particularly around the customs union.
Right, this from Clive Smith. If the EU refuses the UK further extension on the 10th of April, but the British Parliament still refuses to vote for a no-deal Brexit, which organisation takes precedence? In other words, can the EU force the UK to leave on the 12th of April with no deal, or do they need the UK Parliament's assent to this course of action? Who has power?
Well, it's not really about the EU forcing us to leave. What happened when we triggered Article 50 in March 2017 is we set the 2-year ticking clock set out in the EU treaties, and that's what we're running down the clock on, really. So it's the legal default in EU law and also sort of in UK law, but it's not really anyone's fault. I mean, you could argue that the fact that we did trigger Article 50 when we did means that actually it was our decision to essentially end up with a no-deal legal default rather than the EU decision.
A no-full default. Right. This from Anon. If there is a no deal, what will happen to the existing rights of expats living in the EU? Huge question.
Yeah, so essentially, I mean, the rights of the citizens have been protected in the withdrawal agreement. If we don't have a withdrawal agreement, then, you know, rights aren't protected in the same way. The UK has said that they are going to guarantee the rights of EU citizens living here, and it's not really up to the EU, it's up to individual member states to guarantee the rights of UK citizens, so expats living there. And they have, you know, most member states have reciprocated. I mean, there are some questions about where the stage they're at in sort of legislating for and guaranteeing those rights, but it does depend on member states. It really depends where you're living, and you need to sort of find out what's going on locally. OK, Ken Brown has asked this. Why are the DUP objecting to the backstop whilst we keep being told that it's meant to protect and maintain an open Irish border? So their concern is about what happens in the relationship between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. So what the backstop does is it maintains regulatory alignment between Northern Ireland and the EU, but there's a risk from their perspective that Great Britain, which doesn't have the same obligations, could choose to change its regulations and sort of diverge from Northern Ireland. Now, the UK government has said it's not going to do that, but that's one of the big concerns, is that you end up having a border in the Irish Sea, which for sort of the DUP as a sort of party of the union is just not acceptable.
I've got a question here from Peter. Would a general election solve the Brexit deadlock?
I mean, that's a good question.
It is. And it's an unfair question, but I'm putting it to you nonetheless.
I mean, it really depends what happens with the general election. I mean, a lot of people are touting it because I think that a lot of people are very frustrated with Parliament, that they haven't found some way out of this deadlock, this stalemate that we're in. You know, it depends what both parties decided to do. What would their Brexit sort of position be? It also depends whether you end up coming back with a majority. And I think that's the concern for a lot of people, is that actually you have a general election, you come back with a hung parliament, which makes it harder to get things through, whether or not that's from sort of a Labour government or a Conservative government side. And so actually you could still end up, yeah, exactly, nothing changes. And we'll still be having to resolve what we need to do in domestic law to be able to leave the EU.
And you'll be back in here answering questions on Ask This in 2037. Maddy, thank you very much.
No problem.
Good to see you, as always. Thank you very much.